All right, here we go. So let's get into it. This is the Berserking Mace Whirlwind Barb that I have been playing lately. And now, honestly, it's been absolutely great. I've actually switched over from using swords to playing this Mace Barb. And the playstyle is a little bit different, but it is a lot of fun. And so I wanted to showcase it, go ahead and show what I've been doing and the changes that I've made to basically make this build work. Now, this will be a pretty long video, a pretty comprehensive video of pretty much every decision that I'm making. So there will be timestamps that you can use, but try to follow along because if I'm going to be honest, right now this build plays pretty damn well, and I'm very far from optimized. There's so much more that I think I can do, so much better gear that I can get. So there's a lot that I want to show you. This isn't like a perfectly optimized build just yet. So first and foremost, why play Mace? A lot of you are probably playing the sword Whirlwind Barb that inflicts a bunch of bleed. And the simple answer is, well, it does more damage. Mace does more damage, and um, that's not to say that sword is bad. Swords are still really, really good. The more bleed style, it is very good. But I had a problem with bleeds, in that so much of the damage was backloaded in the form of a bleed. And if you're looting enemies anyways, it kind of sucks to like go past them and let the bleed tick out. Especially true if you're playing group play. Sometimes I would set up a big bleed, and then like one of my friends would just come and kill it anyway. So it feels like you're just wasting a lot of damage. The good thing about playing Mace is that a lot more of your damage is front loaded. You're just kind of killing things right away. You're doing these humongous crits that are just going to kill enemies, slam elites so much faster, and you're not really reliant on bleeds quite as much. So that's probably the number one thing. I also think that this build is pretty fun because you're going to be running with Berserking a lot of the time, and as a result, it's just a pretty. I don't know. I think it's a pretty fun build. It is, I think, a little bit squishier as well. So there is one thing I want to be very clear about, that this build is 100% designed for basically like I'm level 84 right now. I'm just trying to basically come up with a good build that I can use to power farm my way to like 100, as well as do nightmare dungeons within that are about 2 to 3 levels higher than me. And this build does that absolutely amazing. It works great for that purpose. I would not recommend this for hardcore, or if you're trying to do some kind of like high end nightmare dungeons. This is specifically built for farming, like the similar level dungeons. Okay, so we're going to be covering everything. Let's start with the abilities first. So we go to our tree. First, we're going to start with Lunging Strike, of course. We'll get Enhanced Lunging Strike. This is basically just for movement. And then this one's also really good Combat Lunging Strike. It's just going to give you Berserking. One thing to think about for this build is that Berserking, you always want to have Berserking going. It's kind of like the core of this build is to always, always, always be Berserking. This just gives us another way to get Berserking, and it's kind of like an easy way to fish for Berserking procs. Moving into our second, we got Whirlwind. You want 5 points of this, of course. And you can see I have items contributing as well. An Enhanced Whirlwind to get some more Fury. And instead, because we don't have a slashing weapon, we're going to be using our Mace. We want to go with Violent Whirlwind. One thing to think about is that this is going to really encourage you to channel your Whirlwind a little bit longer than you might be used to on the slashing build, just to get that extra damage. We're also going to go with Pressure Point here. Your core skills make enemies vulnerable. Um, if you've played enough Diablo 4 by now, you probably know that vulnerable is like most important thing in the game right now, and that's going to come up a lot. Vulnerable is super, super important in this build. Basically, your goal is to kill things within like a 3-second vulnerable window by doing so much damage up front that they just kind of die. Okay. Over here in our defensive skills, Rallying Cry, probably one of the best buttons in the game right now. So it's going to increase your movement speed as well as your resource gen. And we do run all 3 shouts, but yeah, Rallying Cry, very, very good. You're going to want to get the Unstoppable, which is going to basically make you pretty much CC immune to like almost the entire time. And then as well as Tactical Rallying Cry for more Fury and more resource gen. We also go for Challenging Shout. This is going to be our main DR cooldown, as well as another shout. Get some bonus life, as well as some more Fury. This Thorn's not that good. Don't really bother with it. One thing I will say is that I might be alone in this, but personally, I don't know how much I love like getting 5 out of 5. It's still really good, but now that it doesn't scale quite as well anymore, I feel like taking like 1 point out for 48. Sometimes I'll play around with that. I'm not actually 100% sure if that's the answer just yet. Now over here we grab just 1 point in Warcry. Really, the reason why we play Warcry is because it gives us Berserking, right? Um, our key here is that we always want to be Berserking. We always want to be Berserking. Once we start berserking, then we can hold our berserking, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But Warcry gives us berserking, and then we get, enhanced Warcry, and we get power Warcry for just a little bit of a damage bonus. This base life not really necessary. There are some really good passives here. I really love 3 out of 3 swiftness because again, this is kind of like a speed farming, or like a very efficient farming guide. If you're struggling, you can drop these points because movement speed isn't really like doesn't actually affect your character. Also, 3 out of 3 booming voice, absolutely required, so that your shouts last a little bit longer and you can get closer to having full uptime on your shouts. Raid leader and guttural yell are actually pretty good. Personally, I really like guttural yell, and then in parties, I really like raid leader. If I'm playing with like another person. Um, so you might want to consider these, especially if you need a little bit more damage reduction. I think guttural yell really helps a lot. We also grab 3% damage reduction while berserking and 18% fury gen while berserking. Again, our goal is to always be berserking, so these are really good, very important stuff to have. Now, over in weapon mastery skills, I grabbed 3 out of 3 pit fighter because we're always doing close damage, so this is just a really nice extra thing to have. And then I throw 1 point in no mercy here. Honestly, I think no mercy is actually a little bit better. Would I would be interested to see how I can actually get more points into No Mercy. This is probably the one thing that I'm still kind of working out on. And then we got Hamstring over here. Now you might be thinking, why the heck are you running Hamstring? Isn't that for swords? Sort of. Hamstring is probably, I would say, like the single most efficient point you can have as a barb. The hamstring package of just applying some kind of bleed, it unlocks so much more gearing options and so much ways because slows count as a crowd control. And so anything that does damage to crowd control, damage to slowed enemies, that's all gonna basically all of your abilities are now all your damage now slows, which I think is really good. Especially because like this one again, you're doing extra crit chance against slowed enemies. Now we're always doing that. We're always having no mercy up every single time because we're always going to be doing bleeds. And I'll get into that in just a bit once we talk about the skills. Or sorry, the legendaries. Now over here for your ultimate skills, we definitely want to grab Wrath of the Berserker. I think it's just way, way, way better. Call the Ancients, I don't think is as good simply because Berserker gives us a button that we can click to get Berserking. This is really good, and honestly, sometimes I'll actually even use Berserking for trash if I don't have Warcry available to get that Berserking timer going. Just getting yourself Berserking is very, very good. And of course, we'll get the extra movement speed and the extra Fury gen. And then this one, Supreme, also very good because that Berserk is going to get stronger over time. A couple of really good passives here, and this is really one of the most important parts of why using Mace is so good. Heavy-handed, of course, you're dealing extra crit damage. This is a great passive, but you can also use Wallop here because we're going to be using our Mace, our bludgeoning weapon. So we're getting an extra 15% damage on vulnerable targets. And we can also go Concussion here as well, where lucky hits have up to a 45% chance to stun enemies. Now, lucky hit, Whirlwind actually has a pretty decent lucky hit. It's something like 22% chance, and you're hitting a lot. So I actually think that concussion is pretty good just because you're going to get a lot of stuns. And this kind of acts as like a damage reduction where if they're stunned, they're not hitting you. So this helps keep you a little healthier and you're not just going to get like randomly one shot by like a pack of mobs that you ran into. So concussion's great. Wallup's great. This is really, I think, the best part about using Mace. Now, over here with our key passives, I know everybody loves to go Unbridled Rage. I really think that this is a bit of a bait. If you don't have your Fury set up, not only is it going to be very hard to keep spinning and doing your Whirlwind perpetually, but also it's going to be a pretty bad quality of life when you're constantly having to stop, constantly having to wait for your cooldowns. You're going to be like pressing Lunging Strike to try to get some Fury. It's just not, it's honestly, if your Fury is not fully set up, don't get baited by Unbridled Rage. You can just go Unconstrained as well. Unconstrained, first off, the Fury cost is so much lower, so it's a lot easier to keep spinning forever, but also it's going to increase Berserk's maximum duration. Again, our goal here is we always want to be Berserking, so this is going to be a huge quality of life passive that's going to increase the window that you have to stay Berserk. It's going to be good because you're not going to have to rely on much as using Wrath of the Berserker. Usually you'll be able to hold Berserk indefinitely and then just wait for Warcry to come off cooldown to start that Berserking chain again. You never want to be in a situation where you can't Berserk from Warcry, you can't Berserk from Wrath of the Berserker, and so you have to use like Lunging Strike to try to get like a crit. It's not fun. Honestly, it's not fun. So Unconstrained, very, very good talent. Honestly, I think it does the job great. Now, let's talk a little bit about skills. Or sorry, before we talk about gear, I wanted to quickly go over what legendary powers we're using. So ignore the stats right now. We will talk about that after. Right now, I just want to talk about legendary powers and then why this build works. So in our helmet, I put Grasping Whirlwind. I think this is great. It's just gonna suck everything together. It really helps speed up those packs. Um, Again, it's not really adding like damage or survivability, but it is a huge quality of life. So Grasping Whirlwind, fantastic pick. Now, this probably the most important. You have to have this relentless berserking. What it does is that on lucky hit, it has a up to 40% chance to extend the duration of berserking, double this duration if it was a crit strike. This is why the build works. This is why we can get infinite berserking because every time we crit, or basically every time we crit with our whirlwind, which happens a lot in our packs, you're going to extend that berserking window. And especially with unconstrained, remember that duration of berserking goes up an extra 5 seconds. So you actually have a pretty big window where you can keep looking for mobs to keep extending the duration of berserking. I'll tell you guys right now, if you're not berserking, you're not doing that much damage. You want to be berserking at all times. In our gloves, I run Gores. Honestly, I don't think Gores is that good. The whirlwind effect that explodes is decent, but really, I think these gloves are a bit overrated. You could probably get away with just using some kind of regular gloves with good rolls on them as well. Probably the one thing that's really nice about Gores is they do have a lucky hit chance. Because we're relying on lucky hit to extend our berserking. Lucky hit is surprisingly good in this build. But again, these scores are not very good. I'm kind of choosing it for fun, honestly. Okay, so in our pants, I use Protector to damage an elite enemy, giving you a barrier. This is going to be just a little bit more survivability, and it's also going to help with damage a little bit later down the line when I talk about conceded. For our boots, we're running Ghostwalker. While unstoppable, you gain 19% movement speed and can move freely through enemies. Rallying Cry gives us unstoppable, and we're unstoppable pretty much most of the time. So this is kind of like a flat movement speed bonus that you get. It's very good. You can toss this in your boots. Maybe you can toss in your amulet if you really want the movement speed. But I really like Ghostwalker. You can also run the one that gives you movement speed when you crit, but I think Ghostwalker is just better. Now, let's talk about our most important offensive aspects. Starting with our weapon, we got Dire Whirlwind. Whirlwind crit strike is increased for each second it is channeled. Again, remember that we're running the Whirlwind talent where after 2 seconds it does 30% more damage. So you're heavily incentivized to hold your Whirlwind and keep spinning as long as possible to get that full buff, especially with Gores too. So as a result, you have to have Dire Whirlwind in this build. Getting a perfect roll like this is going to be so important, and you should definitely be putting this onto a two-hand weapon so you get the double effect. One trick that you can do if you're playing Mace, for example, is to actually put the Dire Whirlwind on your other weapon, put it onto like a sword, because the only thing that matters when it comes to using this build is going to be the damage of your Mace. These guys are your other 3 weapons are just stat sticks. They don't really matter. So you can put like a perfect roll into your sword and just kind of hold it while you wait for like a better mace to come up. Okay. Then we go for conceded. Again, we're running a protector here to get a barrier. By the way, you can also run temerity here. You don't have to you don't have to have temerity. Protector works fine as well. But if you have temerity, I don't have it yet, so I haven't really been able to play test it. That's another option as well. But basically, the idea here is we want to be getting a barrier so that conceded does more damage, right? This is a pretty good roll, so yep. Now, Berserk Ripping, very important legendary. This is why we run Hamstring. Whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, which is pretty much always, we're always berserking, we're always dealing direct damage, a portion of that is going to be dealt as a bleed damage, as an additional bleed damage. Now, the roll doesn't really matter. It doesn't like the bleed is kind of irrelevant, but the important thing is that as long as we're berserking, which is essentially always, we're always making our targets bleed. So Berserk Gripping, absolutely core to this build. You have to have it. You have to have it somewhere. And that's going to enable Hamstring to always slow. Everything's bleeding. Everything's slowed, which is awesome. And that's also why, at this point, I can talk about the fact that we don't actually need two-handed sword expertise, right? We don't need the sword anymore to inflict the bleed because Berserk Ripping is going to be doing that. Also, I forgot to mention, but we do use two-handed axe. This is so that we can get the extra. So basically, when it's in here, we get 15 damage to vulnerable, which is great. And then because we're using a mace, we're going to be getting more fury and more crit strike to vulnerable enemies while berserking, which again, we're always berserking, so that's good for us. Now, talking about our other weapon. So again, is just a stat stick, but I like to run Limitless Rage on here. I have a perfect roll of Limitless Rage, doubled with the two-hander bonus. This is just going to make your next whirlwind do a lot of damage, and it's great. I think Limitless Rage is really really good. Some people like to. I've seen some people run Conceited on the two-hander, but personally, I think Limitless Rage is just better, especially when you combine it with Edgemaster, which I run on the necklace. Skills deal more damage based on your primary resource. So basically, if you start a whirlwind with full resource, you're going to be doing an insane amount of damage because you're going to get Edgemaster and Limitless Rage. It's going to be awesome. Now for your rings, super important. You want to be running Echoing Fury, which is going to give you Fury per second from your shout skills. Uh, and then you're also going to be running Bold Chieftain's Ring. Whenever you cast a shout, its cooldown is reduced based off nearby enemies. These two rings, Echoing Fury and Bold Chieftain, are so important to pretty much every bard build I've seen come like at all. So you definitely want to be trying to get these rings as soon as possible. Even if it's not like a perfect roll on the legendary, you have to have these. They're so important. I would really recommend that if you're struggling to get the rings, spend as much time as you can gambling obols at the ring, like at the obol vendor for rings, so that you can try to hit this legendary, because it does. I think it only comes on rings. So yeah, just keep that in mind. It is pretty necessary. So that's all the legendaries. That's how they function. Again, the one thing I want to talk about is you could also like I've seen some people use like Rage of Haragath. That's the one that reduces your cooldowns when you like bleed enemies. I've heard that's a little bugged with bleeds. So personally, I don't really, I haven't really been able to test it yet. I also don't have it yet, so haven't been able to play around with that. But again, Relentless Berserking, super important. Dire Whirlwind, very important. Berserk Ripping, super important. Those are probably, and then of course the rings. These are like the most important, especially this chest piece. You really really need it. Now, one thing I want to talk about is that this is a pretty offensive, very offensive build. So if you are struggling a bit to survive, you do have a couple other options that we can quickly talk about. Um, there's the two big ones that I would probably recommend would be this one right here. Where is it? Um, Disobedience, where you get increased armor when you deal any form of damage. This is actually really easy to upkeep because so many enemies are going to be bleeding. So you're actually going to get a lot of stacks with this, and it's going to increase your armor a lot. I think Disobedience is pretty good. I would consider like maybe putting this on like even like my necklace or something like that. Uh, Otherwise, the other one that's I think is also pretty good is Numbing Wrath. Every point of fury grants 19 fortify. This one, I think you could like maybe replace like Grasping Whirlwind, because again, Grasping Whirlwind, it is really good. It's a huge quality of life, and I absolutely love it. But again, it's not adding like survivability or more damage. So yeah, like instead of Gores and instead of Grasping Whirlwind, I would just take those and just kind of rearrange things a little bit. But yeah, that's my build right now. Now let's actually talk about gear and stats, okay? Um, so here's a really good time to talk about a couple things. Most people, I don't think, are optimizing their gear. If you do have optimized gear, you will do insane damage. And I'm just going to be honest here, I'm not even farming. My gear it's trash. It's so far from being optimized that there are some pieces I will show you here that you will actually be shocked at how bad the stats are. Um, so again, I think a lot of people think that their build is good, but then when you actually look at their stats, they are nowhere near fully optimized. There's so much more to go. And this build is, I mean, I'm like one-shotting mobs pretty much, and it's crazy how much more there is for me to go. Now, the one thing, real quick, in general about stats, is that the most important thing for you to realize is that there's only 3 types of damage in this game, and that's vulnerable damage, crit damage, and every other kind of damage. So as a result, because every other kind of damage is all lumped into this one big category, vulnerable damage and crit damage are your most important aspects, and it's not even close. Those stats are so damn important, and a lot of the mid to end game is going to be trying to get as much vulnerable and crit into your build as possible. So let's go through our gear again. This time we're just talking about stats. Over in our helmet, the things that we're mainly looking for is some kind of cooldown reduction, absolutely necessary. This isn't a really good roll, but again, it is cooldown reduction. We're also looking for maximum life, which is great. And then outside of that, I would say just look for some kind of survivability stuff. So something like strength, some kind of all stats is pretty good. You can get armor percentage. For me personally, here I have some dexterity, which isn't great, but it does help your Paragon board, which we'll talk about later. And then also I have damage while berserking. Again, this 20% looks like a big number, but remember, it's all in that third everything else category, so this isn't actually as impactful. I would much rather have something like uh, some kind of strength roll or some kind of like armor roll instead of the damage while berserking. That would give me way more survivability. Now onto my chest. This chest, I'm not gonna lie, is complete trash. There are just a bunch of useless stats on this. Resistance is probably the worst stat in the game, and it's not even close. And I have two resistance rolls on this. Like it is really, really bad. Now, your chest and your pants are your main defensive pieces. So, as a result, for your chest and your pants, you're going to want to have as much damage reduction and as much life as you can get on them. So, this one is okay because I have damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding. But for the most part, like, that's it. Damage reduction from distant enemies isn't bad either, but I would much rather have damage reduction from close enemies. I would much rather have just general damage reduction. I would much rather have max life. And also on your chest, you can get ranks of challenging shout, which is again your DR cooldown. So if you do see, getting 3 or 4 ranks of challenging shout, I would definitely pick that up as well. Okay, so going on to your gloves, again, I'm using gores. It's really not necessary. I actually don't. I might honestly consider getting rid of this altogether. But gloves, along with your rings, are a really good offensive piece. So the most important thing that we're looking for is always going to be ranks of Whirlwind. That's a non-negotiable. You have to have. You're going to want to have 3 ranks or 4 ranks of Whirlwind. I would really even encourage going for 4 ranks of Whirlwind. It is quite a bit. And then for your offensive, your stats, you're going to want to go for some kind of lucky hit chance. You're going to want to go for crit, and you're going to want to go for something like strength. Attack speed's not that good for this build. So really, the only thing that I like here is the lucky hit chance and the ranks of Whirlwind. But this could be 4 ranks of Whirlwind. This could have been crit. Gores is just very specific with these pieces, and they do kind of nothing for me. So personally, I'm not huge on Gores. I would almost rather have like a really good statted piece with another legendary power. Pants, just like your chests, you're going to be looking for a bunch of damage reduction, a bunch of survivability, and these pants are actually pretty good. You can see I have flat damage reduction, I have damage reduction from distant enemies, I have total armor, and I have damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding. It's all pretty good. I think the only thing I would maybe want is instead of damage reduction from distant enemies, maybe I could get like max life or something, just because I only have like 6k life. It could go up a little bit more. So that's the only thing I would change here. Also, for the implicit roll on your pants, your potion gives 30% max life as barrier. That's actually why I run red gems, because it's just extra life, extra barrier. But yeah, I think this is probably the best implicit to get the extra barrier as well, especially when you're low. Now for boots, I'm not gonna lie, these boots are sick. They have every single stat that I want. I like max evade charges, although movement speed after evading I've heard is also very good as well. And then as far as my stats go, this is basically perfect. I've got Fury cost reduction. I've got Berserking duration. Again, it helps a lot to keep Berserking. I've got movement speed after killing an elite, and I've got general movement speed. Honestly, outside of better rolls, this is pretty much perfect. I love these boots. They're great. Now let's talk about our weapons. Again, remember what I talked about earlier. The only thing that matters is crit damage, vulnerable damage, and then everything else. So for our weapons, you're going to want basically just that. Real quick, because we're using a mace, the only thing is that the most important thing here is going to be a high damage per second. This one's at 806 item power, so it's got close to 2600 damage per second. But I would honestly like really, really love an even higher damage per second. Now for our stats, you can see here I have vulnerable damage on it. I've got core skill damage. I've got all stats, and I've got strength. This isn't great. This isn't like a perfect thing. Instead of the 60 all stats or instead of the core skill damage, I would much rather have something like crit damage, right? You always want crit dam and vulnerable damage on your weapons because they can roll so high. So this is far from perfect, but this is just the idea. You want 3 damage rolls and stats for all your weapons. One thing I also want to talk about is because your mace is your main weapon, right? These other guys are just stat sticks. The DPS does not matter. The only thing that matters is the rolls. That's also why we really want to be using swords for your dual wield and a two-handed sword, because swords have the crit strike damage implicitly. So this one has 26 crit damage. All swords have crit damage on them, whereas like a mace has like overpower. I think axes have healthy. You don't want that. You want three swords and you want to be using your mace. Now for this one, right? Let's take a look at what our stuff is. We got crit damage here, we got vulnerable damage here, and then we have damage to slow and damage to close. Again, damage to slow, damage to close, that's okay. They're not as good as crit damage and vulnerable damage. Maybe something like strength or some stats here would also have been good, but this is a really good sword for the most part. It's got 4 damage rolls, which I like. Now, our other sword, this one's also pretty decent. We've got our crit strike damage, and then we have our damage to slow, our strength, and our damage to bleeding. The only thing I would change here is instead of damage to bleeding, maybe go for vulnerable damage. That's pretty much it. If I and I could probably re-roll this. I'm just a little poor, but that's probably what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna try to re-roll that to get more vulnerable damage, right? Because we want vulnerable and we want crit damage. Now over here, limitless rage. This is my two-handed sword, right? It's got crit damage on it. It's got strength on it. It's got damage while berserking, and it's got 66 all stats. What is it missing? It's just missing vulnerable damage. So again, it's not perfect, not even close to perfect. The DPS here doesn't matter at all. The only thing I care about is, does it have crit damage, does it have vulnerable damage, and does it have stats? And it's missing vulnerable damage. You can see I'm missing a lot of vulnerable damage. I've got a lot to go. Okay. Now let's talk about our amulet. The amulet, again, this amulet is garbage. There's so much more I could do. The most important stuff that you're looking for in your amulet is going to be CDR, which I do have. It's actually a decent cooldown reduction roll, but I had to enchant that. Otherwise, you're looking for ranks of all defensive skills. Your defensive skills is Challenging Shout as well as Rallying Cry. So that's where I'm getting that extra one. If this was an Ancestral Legendary Amulet, it could actually roll +2 ranks. So keep that in mind. Try to get that. And aside from that, look at my other stats. 3% strength, I don't care at all about, and 11% damage with two-handed slashing. I'm not even using a slashing weapon, so it's a complete waste of a roll. For your amulet, what you're looking for is going to be CDR, defensive skills, and then you're going to want fury cost reduction. And for the last one, you can either get some kind of damage reduction, movement after killing an elite, or amulets can also roll passive slots as well. So you can get like more to wallop or to heavy-handed. And if your amulet has some of those, that's actually pretty good as well too. But yeah, again, CDR, defensive skills, and fury cost reduction, that's like the number one thing that you're looking for. That's going to help your fury cost problems a lot. Now rings are also really hard because you do need these good. You need a lot of good rolls on your rings. And I'm far from having great rolls on my rings. When I'm looking at my rings, the things that I'm mainly looking for is going to be resource generation, which this one has. Looking for crit strike chance, which I rolled. And then you're looking for crit damage, and you're looking for vulnerable damage. If you can't get crit damage and vulnerable damage, you can get other kinds of damage. So this one has damage to slowed enemies, damage to close enemies, but it's nowhere near as good as crit damage and vulnerable damage. This one, again, is pretty garbage too. It's got crit chance on it, but then the rest is just physical damage, damage to slowed. It's got crit dam, which is really good. But if I get vulnerable damage, or if I could get resource generation, this ring would be so much better. Again, this damage to slowed enemies, this physical damage, it seems like a lot, but again, it's all one big bucket, and so it's a lot less valuable than it looks. If I actually go to my like material, or if I go to my stats, for example, right? If I look at like, here's my crit damage, right? 350. This is my vulnerable damage, like 250. All of this stuff, damage with bleeding, damage with core, it all adds up. So it's actually like, it becomes like less. There's like diminishing returns on it as you start stacking this stuff up all the way. Damage with all this kind of just adds up. So again, vulnerable and crit damage are just so much more important. And you really do want to try to get as much of this as possible. Okay, so that's stats. A lot to cover. Again, there's so much more that I could do. Finally, let's talk about the Paragon board. And I spent a lot of time working on this Paragon board. I'm actually really happy with it. It's designed here for level 84, and it's also designed to progress into the most important ones. So you don't need level 84 to do this. You can just try to copy it. Also, for the sake of this video, I've tried to keep all of my glyphs at less than level 15, except for exploit. But I'm not I'm not using the bonus range that you get from level 15. That way you can use these to make your board. So we start with our starter board. It's very simple. We're just going to path through here. One thing that I'll kind of talk about is, in general, getting the little extra points. Like if I had to choose between strength and willpower, typically I would actually choose the willpower, because you're going to need that to unlock some powerful nodes later on. and you're gonna get so much strength anyways that I like unlocking the nodes with like pathing through willpower. So I'm gonna path through here. We grab Brawn, right? Basically, the goal of the Paragon board is to basically get really good glyphs and also really good yellow things. That's kind of the goal. So we're gonna path through here, grab these, and we're gonna get exploit. This is probably the most important and the best glyph for Barbarian, and it's like not even close. Every time once you activate it with 25 dex, the first 3 seconds you damage an enemy, they're going to be vulnerable. So your goal is going to be to kill that enemy in 3 seconds. It's kind of how this build works. You kill things while they're vulnerable, you do a billion damage to them, and they die, and it's great. So exploit, super important. And it's very easy to get the dex here. There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dex nodes. You got your 25 dex. Very easy. And what I would also do is grab Iron Strength and Raw Power. These are really good. And then you can basically work your way up and go into the second one. And what I like to do is I like to go for Decimator. Now, we're not actually going to be using Decimator because we're not using a two-handed slashing weapon, but I like this one because it's got a lot of vulnerable damage on it. We're going to path through here, grab these, right? So I would go here, and then in the second slot, I would grab Marshall. Marshall's got a couple things. For one, it grants bonus to all your magic nodes, which is really good because we have some vulnerable damage nodes here, so these are going to get an extra bonus. Um, and most importantly, after casting a shout skill, cooldown of your shout skills is going to get reduced. So this is really good. It basically is a 2.4 second cooldown reduction on your shouts, which is nice. We want to have as much shout uptime as possible. Um, Marshall requires 40 strength to get this, which is really easy because you can get 10 strength from here, 10 strength from here, and then the rest is like 1, 2, 3, 4. That's your 20 strength. It's really easy to get this 40 strength on Marshall. And then you can just grab like the vulnerable damage, and just kind of work your way up. Okay. Now, before we exit Decimator, there's one more reason why I really like Decimator, and that's because there's another vulnerable damage like block here. So I like to path through, get vulnerable damage, and then pillage, which gives us some more vulnerable damage. Especially if you have your 260 willpower by now, you're getting another 20 vulnerable damage. It's actually crazy how much vulnerable damage you can get from just this board alone early. It can really, really help your build if your stats aren't there yet. After Decimator, we're going to pick up Weapon Master. Basically, going to work our way left and grab Weapon Master. Also, don't forget you can rotate the board if you're not, if it's not working for you. Again, we don't care about Weapon Master; it's a little too far away, and we're not swapping weapons anyways. So you can start here, work your way through, and then we're actually going to go and pick up Hunter Killer in this block, which is damage to elites, movement speed after killing an elite, and then this one, of course, a bunch of damage to elites. But it is going to require Dex, which is again why all stats is like not that bad to pick up on our gear. Now we're going to work our way up into this glyph socket, and here we're going to grab Disembowel. It's a little bit more physical damage over time, which is great, but most importantly, killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your shouts, basically, by 1 second. This is good because, again, we're always berserking, we're always bleeding, meaning that every time you kill anything that's bleeding, you have that 10% chance. It's going to help your shout uptime quite a lot. Over here, this one requires willpower. It's really easy to get willpower. There's a lot of willpower nodes here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Very easy to get your willpower. And you can also pick up these rare nodes as well. I like the physical damage as well as the extra armor. It's pretty good. And one thing I would kind of tell you as like a general thing, because there's actually quite a lot of blue nodes here. Eventually, once you have like the level 2, the increased range, I would actually put Marshall here as well, and then just grab all of these blue nodes because Marshall buffs blue nodes, so you're getting like way more. But again, you don't really have to worry about that. That's just kind of like something you can think about. Once you get like level 15 Marshall, you can put Marshall here instead, and then move Disembowel to that board. If you're like level 90, level 100, this isn't optimized for level 100, so there's a lot of optimization I think this Paragon board could go through. Anyways, once we're done with Weapon Master, we're going to work our way out, and we're going to go Warbringer. A lot to do in Warbringer. First and foremost, we work your way up into this glyph socket. Again, I'm picking up all the willpower and dexes that I can, so I can unlock stuff. And in here, I'm going to go with Wrath. Extra crit damage with core skills, which is great because we're critting a lot with Whirlwind. And also skills that critically strike generate Fury. This board, Warbringer, is going to really help your Fury problems. And, if you're struggling with Fury, this is where a lot of it gets solved. So over here, we're going to get this extra Fury. And this one requires Dex. So we're just going to pick up Dex. Pretty easy. Get your extra Fury. You don't have to get this physical damage yet. I held off on this a little bit because I didn't have the Dex at the time. but it is really good. This one's not as good. All res is just not that strong. Okay, so once we got Wrath, we're actually going to path our way backwards, and instead we're going to go this way instead. The reason why is because we want to get Hungering Fury, which gives us max Fury as well as Fury on kill, and we can also get all of these ones that gives us extra Fury on kill and extra max Fury. You don't really need this one that gives +4 max Fury, but the Fury on kill is really good, and Hungering Fury is great. And again, look, this does require quite a bit of willpower, which is why I really like to go a little bit out of my way to try to get as much willpower and dex nodes as possible so I can unlock this as early as possible. It is huge, the extra max Fury. Um, I mean, you should still get it regardless because Fury on kill is more important, but it's nice to have that. Now, work our way up, and what we're going to do this time is grab Warbringer. For every 75 Fury, you gain 12% of your max life as Fortify. This is nice because you're going to be dumping a lot of Fury with Whirlwind, especially if you're using Unbridled Rage. That's twice the Fury cost. But this is going to give you a little bit more survivability in the form of Fortify. Honestly, I'm considering I'm really considering pushing this build to like the absolute limits and like ditching Warbringer and just not running Fortify at all. But yeah, this one's really great. And if you are feeling good about Fortify, especially if you're using the legendary that gives you more Fortify, you may even want to consider putting in blue gems into your armor pieces. These give you damage reduction while fortified. This might actually be better, but I didn't really need it. Honestly, I'm doing okay on survivability, and I'm playing softcore. So if I die every now and then, it's not the end of the world. I'm not dying. Now, once we're done with this one, we're going to work our way up again, picking up just kind of whatever. And then finally, our last board that I took for now is going to be Hemorrhage. Really, it's not that good of a board, but I like getting Hemorrhage because I really want to use Territorial. This gives you damage to close enemies as well as damage reduction against close enemies. And Hemorrhage I found was a really easy dexterity board. I could just work my way up here and then get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 dexterity slots, unlock Territorial, and I'm 84 and I have 5 glyphs. I have a ton of really strong a lot of strong rare nodes activated, and it's also very close to the exit, so I can work my way into the last board, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. Again, these aren't that good. Physical damage over time is pretty much irrelevant, so don't even bother with this. The damage reduction from bleeding enemies is okay, but I can't even activate the bonus, so I don't even know if I'm going to grab this. It's not really a huge priority for me, but it is damage reduction, which is always kind of nice. Finally, if I did have a little bit more points, not 100% sure, but I would probably go for Flawless Technique. And the reason why I would go for Flawless Technique is because, let's see here. If I rotate it like this and attach it, there's actually a huge crit. This Havoc node right here, there's a bunch of crit that I can get here. I can path through, grab all of this crit damage, and then work my way over to this last glyph. And here I would probably put in I don't know. I'm not actually sure yet what I would put. Maybe something like Imbiber or I think it's like Crusher, which does more damage with the mace. But at this point, when I'm on the sixth board, I'd probably go back and like reconsider everything. So yeah, this is just kind of like my future plans right now. Again, if you're level 100, you might want to look up like a more complete board. But yeah, this is just kind of where I'm at right now with my board, and I like it a lot. It's felt really really good for me. And I think I'm getting pretty much everything I want, which is awesome. Okay, so that pretty much, I think, covers everything. There's so much to go through. I guess the last thing I can honestly show is just kind of show a play case of the build very quickly. I'm just going to do a quick run of Blind Burrows. There is so, damn, that was so much information to cover, but I'm really glad we kind of got through everything. I'll show a quick run of this again. I was playing with Unbridled Fury, but I've kind of liked Unconstrained a little better, and I do think it's a little better quality of life. So I want to showcase this a little bit more. Remember, your plan with this is always be berserking. Try to always be spinning as much as you can, and then you will just crush everything very, very quickly. I'm not even going to use a flask or anything. I'm just going to go. One thing to think about is Warcry. It does give you movement speed, but you actually want to always be holding Warcry to get yourself berserking, and you're going to want to be tracking your buff bar to always be looking to make sure that you have berserking going. You never want to not have berserking. So again, I go to mobs, I start berserking. That's a little purple one, and then we go. And things are just going to die so fast. It's really not even hard. Like, when you get a suppressor field, you can just activate again. I got my Wrath the Berserker going. You will take a lot of damage from like poison and stuff like that, but it's really not that bad. You just kind of keep chugging potions. Wait for your challenging shout to come on cooldown, because when you have challenging shout, you're basically indestructible anyways. And again, everything's just kind of dying. It's really not hard. If you're got a while to go, you can take off your Whirlwind and just kind of keep going. But then I turn it back on. Again, I'm always tracking to make sure that I have Berserking. That buff is just so important. Most important buff you can get. If you see an elite, for example, I can release and just like Gorse kill it, which is also fine too. But I just shred through everything. So I kind of just shred through everything like pretty damn fast. It's not even always necessary. Like things just kind of. It's actually crazy sometimes. Where sometimes I will be like kind of shocked how fast an enemy dies. It almost looks like it like despawn because I just tap it once and it's dead. Especially if you're able to run with Unbridled Fury instead, that gives you twice the damage. But I wanted to showcase Unconstrained because it just has great quality of life. And you'll see I'm just kind of going through everything. Really no problem. Like my health will dip because of poison, but it's not like it's not an issue. It's just something I have to like press. I just have to press healing potions for. That's pretty much it. We go here. We kill the last infested villager again. And you can see that like a lot of our damage is up front, which means it's a lot easier to loot. I can actually just like loot items that I get, whereas like the bleed, you kind of have to sit there and like the bleed almost doesn't do anything because you have to wait for it to die anyways. So again, I'm just spinning, going through. We'll find the last exit because I also want to show you like how to kill the boss. And bosses are really not a problem. Sometimes they take a little bit longer, but like they're not hard. You'll never struggle on bosses. They're kind of like a joke. Honestly, blind burrows is pretty good, but I do feel like the poison damage can be a lot. For bosses, the only thing I would say is just like have Wrath the Berserker so you can activate it, and then like it will just die in like a couple seconds. Not really an issue. It's not something to really like worry about. For the record, that's also the only like again that's why I like the blue ones because it's always you're kind of guaranteed blue gems all the time. You're always going to be slowing with your bleeds, except for bosses, but bosses die in like a second anyways, so it doesn't really matter. The blue gems I think are good because it's just you're always getting that crit damage from your bleeds and your slows. For your jewels, you can just run armor. It's probably the best one. Anyways, that pretty much wraps it up. This went way longer than I thought it would, but I'm pretty glad I could get through everything. Um, yeah, if you have any questions, just let me know. I've really been enjoying this build, and I think it's got so much more to go. Like I've seen some people running this with like twice the attack power, which is like crazy. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with where I'm at with this build so far. Um, and I think it's got a lot of potential. There's so much more gear I can get, and I'll be working on that in the future. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'll try to answer them, and I'll see you all in the next video.